Welcome to the Western Bell podcast series, with talks on traditional spiritual teaching and its application in the world today. The intention of the series is to offer something useful for those who are drawn to study themselves and engage practice on the spiritual path. New talks are posted twice each month. The content of the talks is for informational purposes only, and not to provide any kind of counseling, medical, or professional advice. This podcast is titled Halfway Up the Mountain, 25 Years Later. The talk was given by Mariana Caplan on January 17th, 2026 via Zoom, and is based on her book that was published a few decades ago. Mariana is a psychotherapist, consultant, and author of 9 books in the fields of psychology and spirituality, including a forthcoming book about the global mental health crisis. In this presentation, she discusses some ways that spiritual teachers' relationship to power has been problematic. She notes that there are common threads of things that can go wrong even in organizations that have not had scandals or corruption. And she describes traps of students abdicating responsibility to another and of the inner circle phenomenon. Mariana considers topics such as enlightenment, use of psychiatric medication on the path, the guru model, spiritual bypassing, blind spots, and the complexity of receiving benefit from association with a teacher and trusting one's own inner wisdom. At the beginning of the talk, she acknowledges the help with writing that she received from Regina Sarah Ryan, and at the end, there is some discussion about the Association for Spiritual Integrity. If there is benefit in this talk for you, please consider sharing the link to it or writing a review on social media or on one of the podcast platforms. Mariana Caplan.
I'm so happy to see so many people who I know and love and haven't seen for a long time. But how about we just take a moment to come into ourselves, whatever that means. Really take just a moment to connect with our own bodies, our own wisdom, our own goodness, our own love, our own moment of prayer that are coming together is for the greater good, for love, for connection. And I would say that please take what's useful for you and discard the rest. I hope there's parts that are useful, and I can get really opinionated once I get to talking about these topics where you can wrestle with things. And I think I'll talk for just a little while and give a little context and some, I don't know, what's on my mind. And then we can talk about whatever you all want to talk about with relationship to these topics. Okay. I also want to say before I get into these gritty topics that I'm profoundly optimistic about human awakening, about our endless possibilities to grow and transform, about what's possible on the human path, whether we call it the spiritual path or our path of development. So I think there's a lot of challenging issues that I'll look at, but it's only in the service of greater discernment and possibility. So I'm compelled to acknowledge Regina here on this call. Regina taught me how to write, essentially. Once upon a time, I lived very close in contact with the home community. I've kind of been on my own in lots of different ways for a very long time. I was 25 years old when I got to this community, and I was fresh off of a year in India. I was 2 weeks there when my teacher asked me to write a book, and I had no idea how to write a book. Really, I was 25, I was wounded, I was traumatized, I was confused, and I was asked to write a book. And as the story went on, I was asked and supported to write 5 books in 5 years, and Regina taught me how to do it. And so it's just extra special to see you here tonight, Regina. These books that I'm going to talk about, I really hadn't opened up any of them. I hadn't opened up Halfway Up the Mountain in well over 20 years. I hadn't opened up any of my books. So this gave me a little occasion to do that. But what I have done in all of those years is I'm a psychotherapist. And because I started writing these books at a young age, there's been 30 years of my life where people have been coming to me, both readers with their challenges on the path. But then in my role as a psychotherapist, I've ended up being the therapist to many spiritual communities in crisis, severe fallout and scandal. Once I spent 2 years consulting with a community who wanted my support so that these things wouldn't happen. That was really amazing. I've been the therapist to some of these teachers, to their ex-wives, to their disenchanted children, to a huge wide range of people who have experienced their challenges on the path. So I picked up this book from my shelf, hadn't come out in over 20 years. When I was asked to write this book about premature claims to enlightenment, I was so out of my league. I was a young woman. I didn't know anything about enlightenment. And so the way that I handled that was just writing these super sincere letters at the time, right? We didn't have email, to all of these different renowned spiritual teachers, asking if I could meet them and interview them. And I got in a car, I got in a plane to India, and I would go with a tape recorder and tape record and transcribe these interviews and put them in this book. It's been a real grace because I still meet people through this book all these decades later. But here was something that was very humbling. So on the front of the book, it says these various people who I interviewed, many of them had passed away. So Charles Tart in 2025, Zalman Schachter Shlomi in 2014, Andrew Cohen in 2025, Arnaud Desjardins passed away in 2011, Christina Groff, 2014, Claudia Naranjo, 2019. A few of these people have had scandals to greater and lesser degrees. So Andrew Cohen, who I knew so well, really, really, really took hundreds of people through a very difficult process. Still had amazing students because even with a challenging or sometimes outright problematic spiritual teacher or guru or guide, devoted students still find their way and can find a tremendous benefit and growth. That's wonderful news. Claudio Naranjo was like a dear friend, an elder brother, and in his later years also experienced a lot of allegations of different sorts. Reggie Ray, really, his community suffered. And I think I want to make a distinction here because there's the really bad things that can happen in some of these situations. Huge damage, manipulation, violence. I consulted with a spiritual community where the consequence of the lama's ignorance led to a disciple's death. Those are the obvious ones, but then there is a lot of difficulty. It comes out more these days that can really happen simply in relationship to power and the structures around power. And I think I'll talk a little bit about that. And then what I would add to that I was thinking about is that even in places where there's not scandals, where there's not corruption, simply organizations that come together to support our growth, there's really, really common threads of things that go wrong, even when overall the situation is good and beneficial. And I'm really noticing that. The students are incredible, the teacher is good, and the dynamics that can happen even in these situations, that really stumps me, because then the question is, how do we do this? So, for example, and then I'll get into some of the distinctions. I pulled up this book, The Guru Question. So, same 26 years ago, I wrote my doctoral dissertation on the guru-disciple relationship in Western culture, looking for a way to make that work in Western culture. 7 or 8 years after that, my publisher, Sounds True, asked me to do an updated version of it. And I had learned and been through so much that my views had softened a lot. So I shed a lot of tears and wrote a much softer version, which was in this book. And then I take it out today and I look at the table of contents and I don't really agree with almost anything in the book. I mean, maybe that's one of the messages that I bring today, is that while being totally optimistic about us and the need and capacity to come together and grow, it's all been very humbling. So that's maybe enough of a start, but some basic points about the topics that I put in that little description. So first we go to enlightenment, right? So at this point in 2026, I think that enlightenment is completely useless and irrelevant term and even goal. So now, right, it's thrown around like Lululemon, I mean, anywhere. But really, enlightenment has been useless for a long time. So when I wrote Halfway Up the Mountain, for years and years, people would come up and say, "Are you halfway up the mountain?" And what I was very fortunate to get to learn as a young woman, I was in India on a one-way ticket by myself at 25. And this is when I met Lee Lazowick, who many of you know, some of you don't. The very same day, in fact, I met him and his teacher, Yogi Ramsurat Kumar. And I had the very good fortune to stay in India by Yogi Ramsurat Kumar for nearly a year at that time. I didn't know what was happening, but I would spend every day in the company of all the people I've met, known, studied with, interviewed. Yogi Ramsurat Kumar was absolutely, by a long shot, I don't want to go up and down, but, broad, exponentially, the most transcendental, including human being that I've ever been in the company with. And at that time, when I was 25, I said to myself, I don't know what this is. I don't know what's going on, but what I'm going to try to do is just open myself and take in as much as I can and try to let it get stored away in me so that as I grow up and I go through life, maybe I can make some sense of it and keep learning from that. And that was a wish that was granted. I just took it in. And why I mention him immediately, besides that I just love to talk about him, is that he shattered my notion of enlightenment when I was very young. And that was such a blessing on the path, because I met somebody whose so-called enlightenment had happened about 50 years before I met him. And it was so obvious to me at that time, whatever had happened was literally just the beginning. And this being in front of me clearly was constantly opening, expanding. I used to see him like a comet through the sky. It took the ceiling off of enlightenment. It took the sides, it took the ground away. And that was really clear to me at the time. Little did I know what my work was going to be for decades to follow, and the problems in the communities and the teachers and the entire new Vedanta circuit and so many different traditions, and the amount of time people have to grapple with enlightenment and the concept of this place that they're getting to, and the evaluations by themselves, projecting others into this state, diminishing themselves, striving, all of these things to try to get to this goal. I knew from a long time ago that there just wasn't a top, but there wasn't just a top, there wasn't sides and a bottom. And I feel like I wish I could just bless everyone who's starting on their path with that good fortune, because then there's just us beings, perfectly imperfect humans, who are doing our very best to grow in all the different ways that different stages of life need us to grow in. And paradoxically, if there's not a goal, then there's nowhere that we are defined in relationship to that. And I can take that to mean that wherever we are and wherever we find ourselves, we're really okay. We're good. We're whole. We're growing. But, if there's no enlightenment, then we don't have to evaluate ourselves on a path, and we don't have to project and imagine other people's development. It just becomes so much less linear. So the fact that I would have dedicated a whole chapter to enlightenment, and now I look at it and feel like it's so irrelevant. Is awakening irrelevant? No. Is meditation and prayer and deep psychological growth and endless human integration, is that irrelevant? No, that's what I do. That's still my passion. But we could just take enlightenment off the table. And it'd be nice if it wasn't in constant advertisement, and it's just not a useful notion. That was on my mind. Okay, I'll go to psychology. I've been studying psychology and yoga and meditation really my whole adult life. But back in the day, around the Halfway Up the Mountain time, there was still this huge debate in spiritual circuits whether psychology was good or psychology was bad. And there was still a whole big thing that psychology exists within the realm of duality and the self. And very wonderful teachers used to describe psychology as like a narcissism and an endless regurgitation of the false self. Fortunately, one of the things in the years that I spent close to Lee Lozowick, he really allowed me to wrestle with him and to argue with him and to talk about what was challenging for me. So we just fought about psychology for years. And he wasn't so into it, and I was really into it, and I really knew that I needed it. And that was, it was a big topic back in that day. And I'd like to think that culture's changed by now because it's so obvious that human beings from every culture come with their own psyche and psychological makeup, and that our awakening and our spiritual growth powerfully impacts our psychological healing and even potential. I don't see psychology as something we do when we're broken and needing help, but just part of this awakening and human integration. And different cultures have different psyches. And so I'll get a little bit to my opinionated views about gurus in the modern day, but not only is the Indian psyche radically different from the American psyche. I mean, when we're in Western culture, American, European, I can work comfortably with psychologically with people in many cultures, but then there's other cultures, often they're far away and just informed so differently that I respectfully understand that I don't understand. When we consider something like Eastern, Indian, Nepali psyche, and an American or European psyche, we're so different. And that's part of what has been the fallacy of bringing in all of these Eastern traditions into Western culture without decades of figuring out how we do this. But I feel very strongly about psychology. I just finished a new book, and I felt for a long time that psychology is a nascent field. It's a baby. It's like 250 years old. It's not a thing that we can put in a box and say, well, that's so limited, because it's actually growing incredibly. And I did a 3-year postgraduate trauma training, learning to work with trauma in the body about 20 years ago. And then suddenly with the pandemic, now trauma it's a topic. It's an understood and overused word, but it's online now. And it's really important. And it's particularly important because for many of us, the deep trauma and wounds that we experienced cracked us open, our need and our possibility for something much greater. But therefore, it's this interesting equation that the people who come to spiritual communities, yoga, whatever, I'm generalizing, there's going to be exceptions to anything, but there's farly disproportionately traumatized and psychologically wounded to even the average population. So we have these wonderful people with their passion open and their veneers cracked and their longing and the willingness to study and engage. And yet we are far disproportionately traumatized and wounded with respect to a general population of normal neurotics. So not only is psychology relevant, but it's super relevant in spiritual communities, and not just for the students, but for the teachers. And everybody who's ever going to be in any kind of role of spiritual leadership, small roles, large roles, to conceive that somebody would not purposely avail themselves to many years of deep psychological growth is almost to me like an ethical miss. It's necessary. And just because a teacher has profound spiritual awakening, might have brilliant and excelled capacities to teach meditation, does not mean that they are psychologically mature and integrated, and many cases aren't. And it's been, I think, a huge pitfall of modern Western spirituality. And then I want to add into here another one, which is psychiatry. And that's a big one because psychiatry is also like a baby. It's a couple 100 years old, and it's a very, very imperfect science. And yet, in my view, like other tools, it's a profound gift from the universe if it's well used. And I have spent 25 years helping I was a graduate school professor, but helping the spiritual graduate students, countless people and clients who are identified as spiritual practitioners and spiritual teachers to be okay with psychiatry, to be okay with the possibility that when well-used, medication can be absolutely necessary and helpful. And it's just this a strange idea that got into the spiritual field. If I were to sum it up, people afraid that if they take medication, they're going to somehow short circuit their capacity for spiritual growth and evolution. And also, when people decide to take medication on the path, and I include many teachers, it's a private thing. It's a private thing that's held like we're, ashamed to do that. And I really love when people are open about their use of medication. I feel like it helps other people. And it's, in my mind, absolutely not a failure and sometimes a sign of great strength. And of course, it can be misused. Everything can be used or misused. But when well used, if we're encountering chronic or long-term or short-term issues that are destructive to ourselves, the right use of psychiatry can open and help and accelerate and support our spiritual growth. So I wasn't thinking about psychiatry because I wasn't even talking about that back in the day. It was like such a no-no. It was like a bad, bad thing. And I'm very fond of psychiatry for its benefits and wish it was talked about more in contemporary spiritual culture. And what's newer in psychology is not only trauma and neuroscience, and neuroscience in my mind is just how science is now able to prove so many capacities for psychology and psychiatry and trauma healing. And if people need science to prove that, then great. It's doing a really good job, in fact. Somatic, so body-centered, bringing the body into our psychological and spiritual growth. I put that in the psychology category. And in my experience, it's not enough to be told that this is important. I was told when I was 25, we are doing an awakening of the body and not just the mind. And, that all sounded really good, but I had no idea what that meant. And for me, it took many, many, many years of depth psychotherapy, yoga, and learning somatic work to be able to access my own emotional body and work with that effectively. So those are just a few ideas about psychology. And when we combine, let's say, the ascending or the awakening of consciousness, which is sometimes considered the ascending journey, and then the descending journey into the psyche, into everything that's held in the body, in the bones, in the tissue, and the descending journey, it's a beautiful intersection and integration that isn't a one-time thing in my mind. It's just something that goes on and on and on. And halfway up the mountain time, these were just new ideas. I'm going to talk a few minutes about gurus and teachers and some of the trends that I've observed over the last 30 years. We put 25 because it just sounded like such a nice rounded number, but it's really closer to 30 years. I do want to say, because I know a lot of you, even some of the many people that I'm looking at are, in my experience, really exceptions to some of the strong patterns I've seen happen in communities around gurus, but of any name, lamas, yogis, rabbis, priests, spiritual authorities. So I not only acknowledge that there's exceptions, but I'm looking at several people who I feel have found their way in this path. So when I think about this, because of my work, there's thousands of people and probably minimum dozens of communities that I'm thinking about. Please don't hear this as a reflection of one community, but more about the culture. So, after writing a whole doctoral dissertation on this topic 25 years ago and updating it, largely with some exceptions, I feel like in Western culture, the guru model has really failed. It's mostly not working for people when it's to the way that it's been imported and shared until now. Some of the things that I don't like about the model, even as I benefited from it so much, I wouldn't be talking to you if I hadn't been a young disciple who was willing to do anything my teacher said. Now I would just probably not be willing to. But Here's a few points that were on my mind. This is all since picking up my book yesterday. Abdicating our own inner authority to another human being has not fared well, at least in the Western world. So although we might not know how to access our inner wisdom, although we might use teachers to help us learn to access our own inner wisdom and our own inner authority, that's where I believe that all of this is going. And I truly believe that there's divine wisdom in every human being. I truly also believe from my own experience that there's an inner physician inside of each of us. And I believe that as we learn to access this, that our own soul is going to have the best map for our own unfolding through life. I know that teachers help us. I currently study meditation with a teacher. I go to groups, I do the practices, and still abdicating our own wisdom to somebody else can be a huge trap. One of the things that has been most problematic in these cultures has been when teachers tell their students how to live. Whenever I start to work with a new spiritual community, especially if I'm working with the leaders, the number one thing that kind of hurts me the most is when teachers have interfered with telling people to have or not have children. Like, this has been so common and so destructive. And I could just shed tears for all the women that I have met who, in their 40s or 50s, and for some reason, when they were younger, found themselves in a spiritual situation where their teacher either didn't believe that people should have children, or they decided who should have children and with who, and experienced tremendous, tremendous regret. I have my own story into that about how I ultimately came to my own conclusions. But this is really common. And I always tell teachers, do not get involved with that. Don't get involved in these decisions about your students having children and not having children. It's just not working. I also, although sometimes it works, I also ask teachers to not get involved in putting together and breaking apart couples and deciding that somebody else would decide who somebody should be with and who they should not be with. Tremendous damage done in that area. And often it's been done worse. I'm thinking of an example. He had the couple divorce. He had the man in the partnership tell their then young teenage daughter about an affair that his parents had had or he had had when his daughter was young. I mean, people have wreaked havoc. Teachers have wreaked havoc on students by running their relationships. And sometimes they do a good job. But when I talk to the gurus, I tell them stop. And same with pets. You don't tell your students whether to have pets and not have pets, and you can have dogs and not have cats and birds. To me, that is just such nonsense. And then the list goes on. I don't think teachers should tell people how to dress and if they can dye their hair and who should wear jewelry. And to me, at this age and stage of my life, I think that's really nonsense. And I don't mind asking them to just stop. There's just so much more important things to do than that. So that's when I get a little bit on a rampage. There's dynamics that happen even in communities where things are working really well. And one of the ones that really bugs me is, I don't know a way around it, but I call it the inner circle phenomena. So around the teacher, there's the inner circle, there's the favorites, and there's the not favorites. And I really mean that I don't know a way around it, but I find it problematic. Georg Feuerstein, he was another wonderful person. I think I interviewed him for that book, who passed away. And he told me something that always stayed with me. And I was recently talking to a Tibetan Buddhist teacher, and she said there's the equivalent of this statement in Tibetan Buddhism. But Georg told me in my 20s, he said, the best place to be in relationship to the teacher is not too close and not too far. Because if you're too close, you get caught up in the whole personality and all of their, I'll call them psychological dynamics. If you're too far, you might not get the full impact of the teaching. And he said the sweet spot's right in the middle. And that was a wonderful piece of counsel. What also happens, I've noticed in communities, especially in the inner circle phenomena, is the idea of service. look, a teacher has a big vision. That's why they're the teacher. And what's to be done is endless. And what commonly happens is that teachers burn out their close students. They burn out people in their willingness to volunteer endlessly. I've seen that particular dynamic again and again. Like, it's not helpful to work people to a pulp. I've had a sleep disorder since I was a kid, and in my years close to Lee, the fact that we couldn't have coffee in the morning when someone who has a sleep disorder desperately needs it just to function, and then we could have coffee at night, and all of these things I don't find very helpful. But the burnout, the inner circle phenomena, the favorites, these are all kind of unanswered conundrums that I'm aware of and can happen even in situations where things are going well and people are thriving. Those were things that were on my mind. Yeah. So I talked for quite a while. How about I pause and, this is conversation. Tonight, I think my biggest motivation was to share the benefit of me just receiving the fallout from, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of students and teachers and communities, and see if there's any benefit in there. So maybe I'll pause and see what's on your mind.
You were speaking about the whole kind of the history of the study of trauma and so on. I grew up pretty much traumatized my whole life. I think I Googled the symptoms of PTSD. I found I had them all. That began a whole inner search on what to do with this and then where to get help and what can be done, all this stuff. In the beginning, I didn't even know what it was. I was referred by a doctor. I ended up talking to this guy. He interviewed me for over an hour, and he was talking to me about my background, my family, all this stuff. And he sort of sat back, and that's when he kind of had his diagnosis. He said, "You're going to be on medication for the rest of your life." This is before trauma was even a common thing that people talked about or knew about. So I went on this medication. I told my teacher I was on this medication. I said, "Okay." And then about 18 months later, I said, "I got to come off this stuff because I don't feel like myself," is what I said to him. And he said, "Okay." So the thing that I got from that, which is why I wanted to bring this up, was because you were speaking about medication. He didn't know anything about that. That was not his thing. But he trusted me. And that's what I got, was that he trusted that I would know what to do for myself. And that was a tremendous reaffirmation of our relationship. So I wanted to present that because you had kind of opened up this whole conversation that I learned that he trusted me. And that even when we went into these really pitched battles sometimes, and I looked at him one time when he was really challenging me. And when I looked at him, I knew that even though he was challenging me, he was on my side. He was teaching me something. He was giving me something. So anyway, I just wanted to present that.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, and I mean, two things that I think about when you say that, and I'm just glad medication's coming up. It's something that I just think is really important. But I made this point, but why do we want to think that because a teacher is really, really wise and realized in a certain area that they know about everything? That's another mistake people make. You can be incredibly awakened with your meditation and your consciousness. You don't know anything about psychiatry. You don't know about women's wish to have a child and, like you said, cats. And again, I'm looking at people in front of me who are exceptions to this, but crazy wisdom, that was another thing that went into these books. And, I made this whole case for crazy wisdom. And in the 25 years since, my God, like crazy wisdom has been used as an excuse for endless abuse and hypocrisy. Like, I'm okay if somebody's really wise and they're passionate and skillful and unconventional, but I've seen and heard crazy wisdom be used to justify endless abuse, really. Yeah. It's like really, really challenging teachings came from really exceptional teachers and still do.
My teacher was a classically trained yoga teacher from India, and he was just dead set against alcohol, which I had no problem with, and also experimenting with psychotropic drugs. I was just wondering, do you think there is a role for psychotropic drugs?
Great. Another good topic and relevant. So back to this point that I feel like it's just in me tonight is I would like teachers not to be the ones who decide whether a student can drink coffee or alcohol or marijuana or do their ayahuasca journey or whatever it is. I think teachers could have their opinions. Oh, and gay. God, the amount of gay students who have suffered because their teacher was against people being gay and lesbian and bisexual and all of that. So I know that's not your question, but I'm just kind of remembering everything that bugs me. So this is a really important topic. I just finished writing a book. I haven't published it yet, on the other side of a very severe, long mental health crisis of my own. And I use that story to try to talk about a lot of topics in psychology that I'm passionate about. And one of them is about psychedelics. And what I would say I see now, because again, we have this huge trend now of psychedelic work. It can be very beneficial for periods of time for people I've seen. Certainly end of life when people are dying and haven't had a chance to experience different realms of consciousness, and for many times grief or severe depression. So there's definitely a role for it for some people for some periods of time. What I am having a problem with, well, in this book, the particular story that I use is of a close friend and colleague. She was a PsyD, doctorate in psychology, trained in somatics and trauma, grounded mother, loving woman, and she died in let's say, a psychedelic related incident. And her father is a Stanford scientist, and the family's wish to bring benefit for others from the loss of their daughter. They did a lot of work on this. And then when I was in my severe mental health crisis, I encountered more people than one would imagine that had extreme casualties in relationship to psychedelic work. So I think it can be beneficial, but I think that it's potentially dangerous. And I was recently at a conference about this, and it was a really good keynote speaker, and I approached him about this. And I learned quite a bit right there. I mean, one thing he said very frankly is that he's well aware of that, but because people who are passionate about it for all the good reasons need funding. And then at this conference, I also saw something really interesting, which was places where it's being studied rigorously, Johns Hopkins and Harvard and all these places. They explained how people get ruled out of the studies. So if there's anyone, this is just an example, anyone on either side of your family who've had depression or anxiety or mental illness, boom, you're out of the study. And all of these criteria that they are using to be skillful so that their trials won't be dangerous, but they basically rule out like anybody who's vulnerable. And then the control group, which they're doing a good job, you have to be responsible, but then the control group doesn't represent the population of people who are actually going to the substances. And of course, it's mostly going to be the people that are ruled out that are going to be attracted to the use of substances because we want help. I'm saying we, right? So that's problematic. And then this graduate school that I taught at in San Francisco for a long time, they have this huge psychedelic assisted therapy program that they're doing. And then last year I noticed, because I'm on their mailing list, that they're now training people to be psychedelic assisted helpers without having to go through graduate school and without having to have thorough psychological training. So when I look at this, and I'm moving back to San Francisco, and I can't wait to stir up trouble and have hard conversations about these things. But I think as a psychologist, it's so delicate what's happening and working with people skillfully. So you blow that up with psychedelics, fine, for all the benefits. But now we're letting people without the training be the psychedelic assisted helpers. And I think that's exactly the wrong direction. It would be people with rigorous training who have had the background and understand the subtle things about psychology that would be the helpers for people, sober helpers to people doing their process. So I've benefited from psychedelic work, and I've also gotten into some dangerous spots because I'm very sensitive and my psyche is, I would say, a vulnerable one. So I learned from that, and it wasn't until my friend's death that I really kind of woke up to the danger. And in this case of my friend who died, paradoxically, it was not the drug, it was water that was the lethal ingredient. So as her father, the scientist, spent a couple of years unpacking all of this, it was a synthetic drug. It was, one of the compounds that the people are using. But what wasn't known to her or the facilitator of the group who was using that, who was her partner, was that with this compound, it kind of mirrored MDMA. It was in that category, that the counterindication for that drug was water. It was being used in a partying context. I wrote a whole chapter on this for my new book, but they were psychologically partying, with their edges of their archetypes and all of these things. And then they were dancing and she drank too much water. I know this because I was talking about her overdose, and then her father just kept coming back to me and saying, no, it was a psychedelic related casualty and the ingredient was water. So that's only to say, with care. But I really don't want anyone to rule in or rule out what somebody else should do. I really believe that even if it's hard to access our inner wisdom, that's got to be the guide with our helpers around us.
So 2 things. I'm glad you mentioned the sweet spot. I had a wonderful 40-year relationship with my teacher. I think because I was in the sweet spot, not too close and not too far. And also because of my own upbringing, because I had a mentally ill mother, I learned very early that the only voice I could really depend on was my own. So when I encountered the teacher and he would say something and I go, no, that doesn't sound right to me. And I could constantly rely on that. But also, the Buddha said right from the beginning, do not take my word. Test this in the crucible of your own experience. And that's the Buddha. So we've got, little lesser Buddhas who are trying to share their knowledge, experience, and wisdom, but you need to test it in your own experience. And so it seems to me that the spiritual training needs to bring that out, that the idea of obeying the guru blindly never worked in this culture. Maybe it worked in another culture, but it didn't work in this culture. So as we go forth, where is that training to rely on the deep wisdom voice, not the egocentric voice, but to know the difference? So that was one thing I wanted to bring up. But the second thing is, yes, we in the West have developed psychology that seems to be a handmaiden to spiritual growth. And do you have some ideas how it can be used wisely in conjunction with the spiritual journey?
Yeah, beautiful. So the last 8 years or so, I've been studying meditation with Jennifer Wellwood, and she's the wife of one of my dearest friends who passed away in 2019, John Wellwood. People forget this, but John actually came up with the term spiritual bypassing, which, if that's unfamiliar for anyone here, it's about how we use spiritual ideas, practices, concepts to bypass and avoid psychological work, human developmental tasks, self-esteem, and such. And the Wellwoods, he wrote this incredible book called The Psychology of Awakening. So what they've done so beautifully is not like spiritual work and psychological work, but really gotten into where they're not just two parallel processes, they're really, really interwoven. And I've had the good fortune in my therapy practice to work with a lot of spiritual practitioners. And there are so many moments when we're unfolding something and their inner wisdom is online, and where we could not say if something was psychological or spiritual. It's we have these two concepts, but let's consider for a moment, we're really talking about our own capacity to awaken to our deepest, broadest, lowest, highest possibilities with the tools that are available in life to us. And that's why I can't even imagine spiritual growth without psychological. But at the same time, in the spiritual communities, these psychological problematic dynamics happen. All these things happen. And I would like for the teachers to really rigorously educate their students in these dynamics. I would like that to be part of the education that's given. But I think a lot of times the teacher just doesn't know. That's not what they know about. And maybe it's not always in their favor to do so. I mean, all these teachers say to your students, like, I want you to be an adult, grow up, really common. It's not that teachers don't say that. They say, go and trust your inner wisdom. But it's not taught. And, younger or newer students or older students who are coming with the real need, they're not going to have that awareness. Like, somebody's got to teach us how to do this. So I really hear you. And for every beautiful story like yours, you knew what to challenge and what to listen to. I think more generally, people are more likely to just kind of swallow the package whole and then later learn some of that. And that's why I just don't know. I couldn't imagine my life without teachers. And at the same time, it's so problematic.
A few things that come up for me. One is I'm really pretty sure that with scandals that occur in communities, they're rooted, I think, in early wounds, in childhood issues that we defend ourselves from and then compensate. And we've got a big blind spot about those things. I think that many teachers are well-meaning, but they just don't see a part of themselves clearly at all. That's kind of been my sense. I know that's a gross generalization, but, power and sex, where does that kind of abuse come from when someone espouses a spiritual teaching? But for me, psychological work has been essential just to open up to things that I didn't even know were going on in me. That was just so critical as part of the process. But also, there's this saying, of course, that psychology can help heal the ego, but it can't do anything about the problem of the ego, so to speak, if you want to consider the problematic aspects of how ego stands in the way when we grasp on it from a free life. So do you feel, regardless of the recognition that there's no top end? I mean, I think that that's really a brilliant perspective on this whole field of spirituality. But do you feel like there is something like a shift in context that occurs for people? Traditionally, there's such a history of that happening for people. Well, all of a sudden, someone wakes up. And that can happen in a momentary way, but in an abiding way. It seems to happen for some people where there is a shift from self-reference to, call it God reference or other reference. I wonder if you'd have something to say about that. But I wanted to mention another thing also, because I get backed up here. I really think that this thing about how teachers use authority really depends on the teacher's context, where they're coming from. That's different for every teacher. If a teacher is really being moved by the process, is that a real thing? Having seen some teachers, it feels that way to me. It has felt that way to me. That's been out of my normal experience, be in relationship to someone who had felt that way about, like with Yogi Ram Sarat Kumar, as you mentioned. But it seems to me that such a teacher, if they suggested things for people, would be helping them to get through what's in the way, to reflect to them areas where they need to grow up. And just to say grow up, I mean, there's just such a difference between talking about something and actually doing it, having the experience of what it means to work with that. And it seems like really good teachers will allow people to make their own mistakes and to disagree and to fall down and get up and learn. Anyway, those are a whole bunch of things.
Yeah. Where do you want to start and all of that? Honestly, those were like 4 or 5 big headings, but let me just see what struck me. Yes, I too have been around teachers who seem to have had, some kind of profound awakening that has potentially stayed there, been somewhat consistent through their lives. But then each one has their blind area. And this thing about the blind spot, every time somebody says, like, I know what my blind spot is, like, that's so common. And that's understandable, because if somebody's been rigorous in their practice and gotten lots of feedback, like we've heard a bunch of times information about what our blind spot is. So it's not out of left field that somebody says, I know where my blind spot is, but like the trap is right in there, because the very well-intentioned belief that because I've been told and I've worked on my blind spot that I know what my blind spot is, it wouldn't be a blind spot if it was illumined. So then the blind spot ends up being reflected in the people around them in some ways. So the Sufi master, I spent a lot of time with him. This is just an example. Like, I love him, profoundly awakened human being. And he's a mystic. He lives in dreams and archetypes, and he can just like close his eyes and there's the beloved, and then he opens up a space, and then all the energy comes into the group, and then you go home, and because they do dream work, then you dream, and then you get these insights and you bring them back to the group. But he was so mystical that the people around him who loved him and spent time there for many years just didn't figure out how to have jobs and human relationships. I think a lot of teachers, they're so deep and absorbed and in love with consciousness and awareness that the social, the human, the relational just is secondary. I was raised Jewish, and as the many years go by, even though I study meditation and all of that, I've been bringing Judaism just so much more as a part of my life. And I have a kid and he loves it. And obviously it can go bad. But what I love about Jewish is when it's working, it's teaching about family, community, contribution. It's everybody's job to help heal the world, cycles. And it's all very like relationally and ethically focused, communion and sharing food and just giving, helping. For me, it fills in like the earth pocket a lot more, because my meditation teacher is brilliant with domains of consciousness. So blind spots, I wanted to mention development, human development. So we're talking about psychology, but then there's just the course of human development and tracking many teachers, over the decades, because I was in my 20s and they were in their 40s or 50s. So you get to watch as their lives go on. And a colleague and friend of ours, she was in New York. She was at the top of her game. She had, all of the people pining after her and her authority. And she, for her own reasons, quit being a spiritual teacher because she saw that just human development was like something that she didn't understand. And she went and did her doctorate in human development. And to just make that simpler, it's like developmental stages in life. So, you might have your awakening in your 20s, but then you have kids, and that brings up so much. It's a whole different thing, what you're going to learn about and wrestle with. And then your parents die, or you get ill, or you become middle-aged, or you go through menopause, and all of these different things. You get old, and like these human developmental stages, they're like another stream. They're not psychology. They're not explicitly or spirituality, but like the process of human development. And then each stage, as far as I can see in my own life, and then with, a lot of people I've worked with who are older, that awakening or whatever it might be, then we have time, the test of time and the things that happen in life through time. And I think I would say the teachers have softened. Life has humbled. The people who are rigorous and sincere and staying with it, like life humbles us. And one trend I noticed quite a long time ago is that the early generation of teachers like Lee, and let's say Jack Kornfield, all the people in Halfway Up the Mountain, like they were like the generation that were new in India, or they came from the West and they had their teachers, and there was so much about rigorous practice and denying ourselves sleep and denying ourselves this and that. And then 20, 30 years later, they were teaching on self-love.
But it seems like this is just not a linear process. And for a period of time, I really needed that rigorous kind of practice. And like once it was in and I had a certain kind of discipline, well, then maybe it wasn't necessary in the same way. And teachers all have their personalities, their strengths and weaknesses. One thing that I think is really important, which seems this way to me, is that it's a red flag if teachers are isolated. Association with peers, oh, yeah. I witnessed that with my teacher, and I just felt, wow, what an example this is to be vulnerable enough to be with another person and not like know everything. And I think things come up that developmentally, it would have been nice if we got through it when I was 21 years old with the first three stages of life. But if not, maybe it doesn't come up until much later in life. So,
yeah. So peers, I would just avail people to the resource of Association of Spiritual Integrity. Jack's here. And one of the many resources that's offered is peer support groups for spiritual teachers. But I think part of the challenge, even with spiritual teachers engaging with peers and feeling that that's their line of feedback, is it's a lot of tit for tat. So spiritual teachers might have spiritual teacher friends. So they're getting feedback from their peers, whoever they are. And they might even be getting feedback from inner circle people. So I've heard many great teachers say, I say and feel that they get their feedback because certain people in their inner circle, they dialogue with things. But all of those functions, like people have an investment. So I want all teachers and communities to really implement systems of feedback for the teacher. And it's like the mid-range people are a really valuable source of feedback because the people who aren't in the ranks in the inner circle phenomena and just the regular people are going to have some useful feedback and perspectives. And I haven't found many teachers willing to do that. There might be themes that have been said, let their students make their own mistakes and all of that. But how about the feedback that can be taken or discarded? But the systems of feedback, that's another thing when I start working with spiritual communities. I just want to get systems of feedback going in. And they're problematic because some of the feedback's going to come from the loudest, most wounded, psychotic people in the community. And those are going to be the people who are most pedantic and spreading the word and all of that. But I'm not seeing teachers mostly avail themselves to rigorous openness to really hearing feedback.
It wasn't until my teacher died that I began a deep dive into not only demythologizing him, but into my psychology. And I think that the refusal, the unwillingness for teachers to look at their own shadow side has been hugely problematic, and severe, profound damage has been done. And there are students that have never recovered. And for me, if I'm really honest with myself, I would say that I fell in love with my teacher, but what I saw was just a basic lack of human maturity in the students. In a way, we were doing the best we could, but there was not an emphasis on psychology, and also the idea of abdicating our inner wisdom. That's like in neon lights for me, because my whole entire life was about not listening to myself, dismissing myself, betraying myself, hating myself. And when people would talk about self-love, I thought, well, that's not very spiritually minded. I mean, it's all about the other. It's not about ourselves, it's about the other. And I tried to live like that as a principal. But it wasn't until I actually experienced and tasted what self-compassion was that I began to understand teaching that I hadn't before. And it was a big piece that I was missing. And I don't know how useful the guru devotee model is in the times that we're living through. I think teachers are essential, good teachers, but the actual model, the model that comes from India and all of that, I think the Western psyche is just so different. And like you said, there have been a lot of failed experiments with that. So there were some things that I wished that I had done differently. But I don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater, because there were things that I got and that I learned, and strengths within myself that were brought out that I don't know that I would have gotten to it on my own. And if I had, it would have taken a lot longer. So there were certain things that were accelerated that were extremely positive for spiritual growth, but there was just an imbalance. And I didn't understand the need. I thought I could manage my own mind. But as I demythologized Lee after he died, I went, oh my God, there is so much there. And like somebody else was saying, there was just a lifetime, an entire childhood of trauma. And I just wanted to be loved. And I could speak about the Dharma articulately and all that, but it was just my need, the inner child, the desire and the need to be loved was great. And I had to go into those places, and I still am. I'm still in a process with it.
There's a new kind of teaching modality that's appeared in the West, non-duality. Though originate in India, it's taken root, and there's a large contingent of teachers, and it's a different kind of teacher than gurus, than traditionally we think of gurus, which reminds me that the teachers that I've known say they didn't want a lot of people, so they kept the community small so that they could have personal observation and interaction with the students, as opposed to teachers like Adyashanti and many others that have hundreds, if not thousands, of followers or people that follow their teachings. So that's another category of the teachers who keep small communities that they work with closely, and teachers that have large groups. But anyway, getting back to non-duality, if you wanted to comment on that in the West.
I know Adyashanti, he's retired, but he really worked humbly and without scandal for his time. I've not been very impressed with a lot of the non-dual teachings in the West. When I looked at like scandal map, it's like gurus, yogis, and non-dual people, modern non-duality. Those are like the biggest areas where I found them. So again, lots of exceptions. Spending so much time in Tiruvannamalai, so Ramana Maharshi, and he had his awakening, and he actually spent, I think, 16 years in one cave and another 14 integrating before he started teaching. But the amount of spiritual bypassing that happens in non-dual spiritual circles is vast. And the prioritizing, it's another can of worms, but let's say the masculine principle over the feminine principle, emptiness, spaciousness, non-thought. It's, I would say, deeply imbalanced in terms of the feminine overall. So, of course, some of the great teachers were incredible exemplars, but I haven't been very impressed with how that's panning out in the West, with exceptions. And we become the exception by, I don't know, doing what we're doing now, just being rigorous and ongoing and sincere and humbled by life. I know that we're out of time, and this is a beautiful big can of worms that we've opened up. And I was just thinking that these are such rich conversations to have. And I don't know why I was just thinking this when I was listening to some of you, but Arnaud Desjardins, who some of you might know, he was a great French spiritual master. But at the end of these wonderful conversations, he would say something like, all these words have been put out and we've talked about so many things. And now you just let the words and all those concepts settle. And then if there's one thing that's been useful or one pearl of wisdom or something that comes, you take that. But I love talking about all of these things with you all. I guess I want to be kind of raw about this. So when I decided to try to have a child on my own, not because I didn't want to, but I was at a life stage where I didn't have a kid and I was nearing 40. And in the community that I was in, and at that time, anybody having a child with modern medicine and fertility treatment, all of that was off the table. And I fought with him mightily about that. And if I was to be obedient and following it, it wouldn't have happened. And it was one of the many times where I took a tremendous amount of space from him and came to my own conclusion. And when I did, I remember I wrote to him, but I had to really leave the bubble of what was happening. I knew that I had to make my own decision about this. And that's why I have such a big bone to crack with teachers who tell people to have kids or not have kids. And I came to my own conclusion. And at that moment, we were still in letter writing, and I wrote to Lee saying, I know this isn't what you prescribe, but this is what I'm doing. And I'm going to try to do this. And if this doesn't work, I'm going to do that. And I would really love your blessing. And instant, the return was what would make you think that you could do anything that wouldn't have my blessing? But I had to come to that. So when I see my child, if I hadn't obeyed my teacher, I wouldn't be here talking to you because of these books. And if I had obeyed him, I wouldn't have my child. So it's really, really complex, right? It's really complex. And let's just let life keep humbling us. But let ourselves, be ground down and opened up and feel our greatness, and then respect the complexity of all of this and be friends, grow together.
Gosh, and obedience, what is that exactly? And is there a time not to be obedient, so to speak?
Oh, yeah.
For sure. But Jack, did you want to say something?
I'm just going to make 3 very short points. Peer support. One of the things that we offer, we're just a voluntary not-for-profit organization, but we have 800 spiritual leaders who signed up to be members of the ASI following a code of ethics and attending webinars. In the peer support groups, half of the groups don't really work. Why? Because spiritual leaders don't know how to be vulnerable. So where do we start with training around self-awareness? You're just scared of your own humanness. So creating that safe space, we have found it isn't really enough because they don't have the skill set of their own vulnerability, of accessing it and being raw in a safe way. And the other thing is, you mentioned power earlier. There's something off around the status we give to spiritual leaders. Okay, it came from the guru model and the deification, but that status has to break down. And it also has to do with patriarchy. That hierarchical status is quite toxic. And it's the many teachers, inexperienced teachers, have a place to hide there between spiritual bypassing and the status that's projected onto them. Whoa. Okay. So then they believe their own propaganda. So, I could talk for ages, but I just wanted to share those points of this is what we have found working with spiritual leaders to be the problems that Mariana foretold 30 years ago.
I'm just so happy to see you all and do what we've been doing the whole time, just keeping at it.